So tonight we're studying about Jacob and Laban, even though we know that the central ones is always Rachel and Jacob. But this is based more on Jacob and Laban, okay? And so the setting, just like yesterday, you can see the setting right there. It's Genesis 29, 15 through 30. And so the story of Jacob returning to his grandparents' homeland is of a person crossing back, right, to his original ethnic culture. And so Jacob had deceived his older brother Esau, as we know. And so their mother Rebekah sent Jacob to his relatives, right, somewhere out there in Mesopotamia, until Esau's anger, remember, against Jacob would pass. That was the whole idea behind the mother sending him out there. But there was another purpose also that we find about later. So it made sense to send him to his own flesh and blood, so to speak, and he would be accepted there. He would fit into that community because, hey, he's one of them, right? So he thought. This is where this intercultural issues happen. And it's good to go to your origins, right? And so perhaps Jacob could find a wife there, right, to avoid his brother Esau's error that his brother chose a Canaanite wife that Rebekah, his mother, rejected, right? He was not supposed to take a wife from the Canaanites. And so Jacob is welcomed with open arms, and Uncle Laban, brother of Rebekah, had, daughters. Now, we only hear about these two daughters, but he could have had more. So they say, well, then how can Rachel be the younger one? Well, it says the younger one, not the youngest one. So he could have had more. The Bible doesn't tell us. It's just focusing on, like I said, these two. And so Jacob decided, that he fell in love with her. We know that they met at a well. Remember the thing about the well? I'm not covering that, but that's how they met, at the well. And I said that's going to be important for the fourth night. And so Jacob decided she was worth the price of 7-year service to his uncle. Besides, it would take 7 years maybe for his brother's wrath to subside. So Jacob works the 7 years, then asks his uncle to fulfill the agreement that they agreed upon and to give him Rachel as his bride. Now, Jacob basically meets his match, right, with his deceiving uncle, because his uncle played one of the meanest pranks that we have recorded in Scripture. So instead of giving Rachel to Jacob, he gave him the older daughter Leah by switching the daughters at night. So when Jacob angrily confronted Laban the next morning, Laban used the excuse of the cultural norm to justify his deceit. What does he say? He told Jacob, now this word is not in the Greek or the Hebrew custom, but that's the word. It just says place, but our English Bible say custom, right? It is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one, okay? So those words point out the reality, obviously, in cross-cultural relations. Traditional cultural norms of the host culture will always triumph as an excuse, reality, or ignorance, right? And so Jacob had no choice but to submit to his father-in-law's scheme, right? And so the theological insight of this is, for the first time in the narratives about Jacob, he becomes the object rather than the source of the deception. And so the similarity between what Laban does to Jacob and what Jacob did to Esau back in chapter 27, Jacob was able to exchange the younger for the older, and Laban reversed it, and he exchanges the older for the younger. So perhaps the 7 extra years that Jacob serves Laban appears to be some kind of a repayment, right, for Jacob's trickery, by calling such a situation, obviously, to the attention of the reader. And so the writer draws an important lesson from these narratives. Jacob's deceptional scheme to obtain the blessing, again, like in yesterday's story, they do not meet with God's approval. And so the writer is intent in pointing out that the schemes and tricks are not the way God designs human beings to work, right? God is working, but not because of Jacob's tricks, right? When Abraham's servant seeks a bride for Isaac, all the parties seek guidance from God in chapter 24, 7, and chapter 26. But in Jacob's story, there's no mention of God after Abraham asked God to bless Jacob. There is no more mention of him. And so Jacob was between 77 to 84 years old. That's what they calculate when he married Rachel and Leah. Now, this is not important. And I remember Brother Ray, he kind of mentioned this in another class that we were doing. It's not important, but it's very interesting. So the way they get this number is they take Joseph's age at 130 when he meets the Pharaoh in Genesis 47. They subtract 2 years of the famine, and then the 7 years of plenty, and then Joseph's age when he started working for the Pharaoh. And since Joseph seems to be born at the end of Jacob's 14 years of servitude, he was therefore around 77, right, when he was meeting Laban. But there's also, there's also has to be some travel time for Jacob to get 66 people out of Egypt, right, and other factors. So perhaps he was a bit younger, at least 47. Considering his fraternal twin, the Bible tells us he was about 40 in Genesis 26:34. And that's how they get the, the age, right? So maybe he was between, the common consensus is maybe he's 55 years old. Okay? We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly. Now, how old was Rachel? Well, again, there are several traditions regarding Rachel's age when she was married to Jacob, depending if they were married before or after the additional 7 years. But most scholars agree that Rachel could have been around 22, right? Which is kind of interesting because we always think 13, 14, like Mary, right? And so the biblical concept of age differs from our modern understanding. And the story of a 77-year-old Jacob falling in love with a 22-year-old Rachel kind of proves that. And so we still have to keep in mind the 55-year age gap between them in order to understand the dynamics in this family. And so we're going to start reading verse 15. Now, some scholars say that part of verse 14 goes with 15, and others say no, it's separate. 15 starts all up on its own. So I'm going to read part of the 14 and going right into the 15. So after Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month, now we go to 15, Laban said to him, "Just because you are a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." And so here I have this image in, I don't have the laser pointer. So that would be Yaakov in the Hebrew, which would be Paleo-Hebrew. That's what I mean, that's Paleo-Hebrew. We have no evidence of any manuscripts in Paleo-Hebrew other than the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they're not like full manuscripts. They're just bits and pieces, like finding the letter A, the letter B, the letter C, and D. And then somebody just puts it all together, and you have the Paleo alphabet. I have a Hebrew Paleo alphabet, and it's all in like that, right? And it's interesting to study. But anyway, the point here is that we normally think of Jacob as a trickster, right? Sometimes our Bibles will tell us that. And so he's actually the heel grabber, right? He's trying to grab his brother so he can come out first rather than the other way. And so we know God changes his name to Yisrael, right? Which means he turns the head of El. I know others have different meanings for Yisrael, but this is a more in-depth study of each word picture, right? Because they go by the picture. Okay, so moving forward, Laban begins by reminding Jacob that they are kinsmen. This is a disarming technique that he's using. Laban offers to pay Jacob wages for his labor. So while on the surface it appears to be very kind and generous, his offer to pay Jacob wages changes their relation from host-guest, right, to employee-employer. So it changes. It's a relationship that in that culture basically binds Laban to observe a very high standard of hospitality. Remember, hospitality was very important in that culture, right? And so it goes to employer-employee, a relationship that demands far less from Laban, right, and far more from Jacob. And so Laban asked Jacob to set his own wage, and while this seems, again, generous, it places the burden on Jacob. Why? Well, because he had to set a reasonable wage where he cannot be taken advantage of, right, or disadvantage of. And so you have to be a skilled negotiator, right? Just like today, skilled negotiators, they know how far to strike, right? Especially if you're going to go buy a car. So if they can get the other person to make the first offer, it's better for them, right? If the other person is not a skilled negotiator, he or she is likely to ask less than the reasonable price. And so if he or she asks too much, then the skilled negotiator can use that offer basically as a starting point, right? To negotiate and to come to a more satisfactory counter offer. So Laban, a crafty man, as we know, who will turn out to be less than fully forthcoming and somewhat ethically challenged, right? he seems to understand the advantage that he can gain by inviting Jacob to set his own wage, right? So we know Laban is far more skilled negotiator than Jacob will ever be at this point. So verse 16 says, now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. And so the writer mentions, when he's mentioning here the elder Leah and the younger Rachel, it's to remind the reader of the elder Esau, right, and the younger Jacob. So the writer establishes very early on that Leah is older and Rachel is younger, right? But the reader has no clue of this minor detail that's going to be very important later. So again, we see that the number 2 being important in this account. The Bible time and time again uses the number 2 to signify a difference, right? When there's 2 people, there's 3 opinions, as they say with the Jews. And so usually when there's 2, it could be enmity between 2, right? Or what they like to, scholars say, contrasting each other. And so this time it's no different, right? At the same time that 2 shows 2 contrasting things also confirm something. So in this case, the 2 testaments of the Bible, they contrast the law versus grace, but they confirm the Word of God. And so daytime contrasts with nighttime, and yet it confirms the duration of a day, right? And so forth. So Laban has 2 daughters who will contrast, and yet they will confirm each other. So Leah means wearied or labored. Some of your Bibles might have an explanation of that. And Rachel means ewe, which is a lamb in Hebrew. So Laban may have had other daughters, right? But these are of the marrying age, right? And are yet unmarried. And that was the problem. And so the others, if he had any more, would either be married or too young to be married. Now, the 2 that the Bible, again, we said focuses is on Rachel and Leah, even if he did have other daughters. Now, verse 17 says, Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was very beautiful. And so the word weak here in Hebrew is rakot. The meaning it's obscure to a lot of the scholars. It can mean gentle, tender, or weak. Now notice this, it describes a desirable quality of meat used for food. So somebody from that time and culture, they understand what that means, right? Because it's something they use for the meat, so to speak. So in this verse, rakot can be translated as weak in the New International Version, or dull in some other Bible versions. So it is possible that the writer is calling attention to the positive appearance, right, of both women, in which case Leah's eyes are lovely up to this point, right? That's what the writer's trying to hint at. However, the content tends to favor a contrast, like we already know, between the elder and the younger. And so the younger being more beautiful, being Rachel, and the less beautiful being Leah. So if that is the writer's intention, then Leah's eyes are weak or dull. So whether lovely or weak, a woman's eyes are especially important in a culture, like we said yesterday, where she's probably veiled, right? So that their eyes are the only part of their body that they can actually demonstrate. So even a long robe cannot completely hide Rachel's lovely figure, right, and graceful manner. So it is not difficult to imagine Jacob being instantly thunderstruck by Rachel's obvious beauty and grace and figure. He saw something in her, and he is just, mad in love with her at that point. So verse 18 says, Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel. And so the fact that Jacob loves Rachel and Laban knows that puts Jacob at a decided disadvantage in these negotiations, right? In that culture, a woman's father can expect to receive a bride price for his daughter, but in most cases, he will negotiate with the groom's father, who will pay the bride price. But guess what? The father's not here. Isaac is not present. In fact, Isaac sent Jacob to obtain a wife from one of Laban's daughter back in chapter 28. But apparently he sent him without resources even to pay for the bride. So Jacob, therefore, the only thing he has is labor, right? Labor to offer to pay the bride price. as we would expect of a young man in love, and with no training in negotiations, Jacob basically sets the price high, 7 years, right? So he offers to serve Laban for 7 years to pay the bride price for Rachel. He states this quite clearly, and that's very important because the reader needs to know that. His obligation is to work 7 years. Laban's obligation is to give Jacob Rachel as a bride, right? So once again, as we read these words, younger daughter, right, we have no clue that younger will turn out to be a serious issue to Jacob's plans, right? It is the second red flag to the reader for him to, or her, to notice, right, in this story. So true to his character and upbringing, Jacob devised a plan, one that will appeal basically to Laban's economic interest, right? And one that is so attractive that perhaps Laban would set aside the custom of giving the older daughter in marriage first. That's if Jacob knows the culture, right? And so basically, he says to Laban, you know, I got a proposal for you. I got a deal that you can't refuse, right? And so I will serve you for 7 years. And so if Jacob is shrewd, Laban is even more shrewd. Laban agrees to Jacob's proposal without hesitation. Laban's like, I got him now, right? And so that's the first sign that the deal perhaps wasn't as good as Jacob thought, because the uncle said yes right away. And so 7 year labor was a large amount of money, obviously. And as to the problem of giving his younger daughter first, Laban could deal with that later. You know, once he does the scam and everything, he knew how to get around it. There's always a loophole, right? He could figure out a way around it if he had to. Now, besides, this may give him an opportunity to solve one of his big problems: how to marry off his unwanted daughter, Leah. Nobody wants to marry this woman, right? So perhaps he could kill, as they say, 2 birds with one proverbial stone, as they say. So, you know, get rich and get rid of Leah all at the same time. And so the word love here has a large semantic field, and this is what I got from one scholar, extending from, it can be romantic love to infatuation to lust, right? So in this case, it's probably best, he says, to translate Jacob was attracted to Rachel rather than he was in love with Rachel. But obviously the Hebrew word there is love, right? So the point being that Jacob's love or infatuation for Rachel is because of her beauty, because that's all he sees, right? And this is why he chooses to marry her and not Leah. Now, verse 19 says, Laban said, it's better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me. And so notice, Laban does not say it's a deal to Jacob's proposal, nor does he refer to Rachel by name. He just says, I will give you, her. I'll give her to you, which could refer to either Leah or Rachel. So Jacob has every reason to presume that Laban is in full agreement, right? And Laban responds masterfully. And so he compliments Jacob by saying that he finds Jacob, preferable to other potential suitors for Rachel's hand. But this also serves to remind Jacob that Laban has alternatives, that there are other, potential suitors that exist, that they may want to marry Rachel, right? That just doesn't make sense, because then you would think that all this time, why didn't somebody already marry Rachel? Why just, when Jacob comes into the story, then he wants to marry her off, right? So Laban responds to Jacob's clarity with ambiguity, right? Stay with me. Laban gives Jacob the impression that he has accepted Jacob's offer, but his words have a lot of what we call wiggle room, right? He's agreeing to it, but not word for word in the way Jacob is thinking. So verse 20 says, so Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seem like only a few days to him because of his love for her. See how it keeps repeating that love for her. And so he has agreed to serve 7 years for Rachel's hand without complaint. And he follows the terms of the agreement exactly. And so perhaps he has become more mature and honorable throughout this time. Jacob wants Rachel badly enough that he refuses to risk losing her by any means, so he's not going to cut corners, so to speak. Right? So in any event, his 7 years labor demonstrates a capacity of great self-discipline and faithfulness, and to persevere for her. So during these 7 years, Jacob would maybe see Rachel frequently, right? We don't know. We can imagine that each glimpse of her kind of fueled his determination to win her. 7 years doesn't seem like a big price to pay for her, right? They seem like almost nothing compared to the prize that he expects to basically win. And so verse 21 says, then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife. My time is completed. I want to make love to her. Now payday has arrived, right? And he again speaks clearly and he's direct, telling Laban, not asking to pay what he owes, meaning his daughter, Rachel, in marriage. Now Jacob refers to Rachel as my wife rather than your daughter. Notice that, right? That's very important. In that culture, betrothal is legally binding, right? In a sense, Rachel is already Jacob's wife, except that he has not yet been granted the sexual privilege associated with marriage. That I may go into her, obviously, is a euphemism for having sexual relations. Now, I don't know if you saw this one in Hebrew, Ish is man and Isha is woman. But if you take the Yod and the He, which is God's name, you get fire. So if you take that from a marriage, you're going to get fire, right? Fire and fire. Now, the word in Greek is gune or gunaikas, right? And so that word can mean either wife or woman, depending on the context, right? So our word here doesn't say, give me my wife. It might just say in Greek, give me my gunaikas, or give me my ish. So the context is going to determine whether it's a wife or just talking about a woman in general. And so verse 22 says, Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. And so the narrator does not tell us what Jacob said in response to Jacob's demand. Instead, we are told what Laban does. So Laban gathers the community for a feast, giving Jacob the impression of complying with the terms of the agreement. However, Laban's response, like his response to Jacob back in verse 19, gives the impression, right, of complying without actually doing so. And so Jacob should know better than to accept Laban's actions at face value. And just as Isaac had been blinded by old age to Jacob's deception, Jacob is blinded by his love for Rachel. So everything points to a satisfactory outcome. Just as Isaac could not imagine that Jacob would deceive him, so Jacob is unprepared for Laban's deception. And so the feast is not a wedding ceremony at this point. There is no mention of the bride being at the feast, right? And it seems to be an all-male event. Now, if you look at this in the Hebrew and the Greek, it just says males, right? All male. Now, if you're all familiar with Josephus, the Jewish historian, he said this, that Jacob was drunk based on the fact that Jacob was coming from Laban's feast. The Hebrew word for feast, mishteh, literally means a drinking party. That's in Josephus' Antiquities, chapter 1. And so verse 23 goes on to say, but when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob made love to her. So Leah, the woman nobody wants, is disregarded by her cousin Jacob, and Leah is discarded by her father, Laban, and her father doesn't want her either, right? Leah now becomes the tool of Laban's trickery. Laban complies with the earlier agreement with one exception, that he substitutes Leah for Rachel. And so Laban substitutes Leah for Rachel, just as Rebekah had earlier substituted Jacob for Esau. See how this is going? We don't learn from our past. So he went into her. This is part of the story that it's kind of difficult to understand. How everybody asks, how could Jacob fail to notice that Laban had given him the wrong daughter? Right? Well, we got part of the answer already. How could he, having looked at Rachel for 7 years, fail to notice that his bride lacked Rachel's lovely figure? So Leah would have to disrobe to consummate the marriage. How could Jacob fail to discern the substitution, before engaging in sexual influence? And the answer, some scholars say, is threefold. First, wine flowed freely at this feast. Jacob was drunk. That's a fact, probably. If you're going to bet on it, I'd probably bet on that. Second, the bride was certainly veiled until she entered the bedchamber, just like these women that are veiled, right? And so third, the room would be dark. So these three factors make it possible for Laban to deceive the deceiver. Laban had it all planned out. It's genius if you think about it, right? And so once Jacob engages in sex with her, now Jacob is bound to keep Leah as his wife. So the image of someone being tricked or forced into sex because of drink is a motif in the Bible. James Diamond, a professor of Jewish studies in the University of Waterloo, he supports this connection by noting that the way Rachel and Leah are described in Genesis 29 has intertextual resonance with the description of Lot's daughters in Genesis 19. How? Well, Lot's daughters and the older said to the younger, right? Laban's response to Jacob, to give the younger before the older. See, those wordings are there, the older and the younger, all the way back to Genesis, right? So verse 24, and Laban gave his servant Zilpah to his daughter as her attendant. And so, just as it was customary for a bridegroom to pay a bride price for his bride, so it was also customary in their culture for a father to give a gift to the bride. A maidservant is a generous gift, right? But the real significance of this verse will be revealed when Leah offers Zilpah to Jacob as a concubine, and Zilpah bears two of Jacob's 12 sons, Gad and Asher, right? And so verse 25 goes on to say, when morning came, there was Leah. So Jacob said to Laban, what is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me? So imagine Jacob's surprise when he wakes up, more than likely with a hangover, on top of that, right, to find the wrong woman in his bed. And so the indignation reflected in Jacob's response is very clear. And so the one whom deceived his father and brother now is the one asking, why did you deceive me? And so Jacob, who was clear and direct in establishing, his wage, demanding his payment, is now clear and direct in his accusation. So imagine Leah's excitement, finally being married. Sometimes we don't think about Leah, okay? She's finally going to be married. She's excited. She's an excited woman right now. She hasn't been able to get a man. So now imagine Jacob makes love to her. She's even more excited. So she's maybe thinking, is this real? Like Jacob really likes me? Wow, right? All that excitement. Now imagine Leah's reaction in the morning when Jacob says, huh? Right? Right? I thought you were Rachel. And so Leah goes from excitement to rejection, right? My father played me. And Jacob finally realizes he was tricked because he says, you deceived me. And now Jacob is understanding, the whole pattern of this. He reminds Laban that he has done his part. Of course, what he really would like is not an explanation, but a remedy. However, he surely understands that having slept with Leah, he's stuck with her. So the reader is heartbroken. Whoever's reading this, right? Heartbroken for the broken-hearted Jacob. But at the same time, the reader is also glad to see Jacob get his, right? For what he did to Esau and his father Isaac. Later, Jacob would take his wives and depart without telling Laban. We know that further in the story. And Laban, later in the story, will say, what have you done that you have deceived me and carried away my daughters like captives of the sword? And so that's in Genesis 31. So this is a relationship where tensions are basically ongoing. And Jacob had pretended to be Esau in front of his father. Now Leah pretends to be Rachel next to Jacob, right? So Jacob had pretended to be his older brother. Now Leah pretends to be the younger sister. Now we don't know if Leah knows about this or not. That's not told. So not only was Jacob tricked, but Leah and Rachel were tricked as well by their father. And so this dysfunctional family, it just continues. And so now Jacob understands what Esau must have felt. Like when he had tricked Esau from his birthright. If Jacob was a swindler, well, Laban was a master swindler, right? Laban certainly knew when, as they say, when to hold them and when to fold them. And so it seems that the likely explanation for how the writer imagines Jacob confusing Leah for Rachel so easily, even in the dark, is that unlike Isaac's familiarity with his two sons, Jacob didn't really know Rachel at all, even after 7 years. Or Leah, because he probably saw Leah more than he did Rachel, who was the younger one. And so that would have been strange for him not to even recognize. Like, they didn't speak at all, like when they went into the room. And so, excuse me, he was smitten with Rachel's beauty. And that's the narrative that's going on through this story. It's about Rachel's beauty and Jacob's love for that beauty. And so, does this mean that the two of them never took long walks together? Who knows? They should have had some kind of courtship, maybe, for him not to know that this was not Rachel. I mean, we don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us these things. We can only imagine these things by how we know a wedding should be, right? But in our culture, not their culture. So it is likely that the writer does not imagine Jacob having spoken to Rachel often or extensively, even during these 7 years, and was not very familiarized with her voice or her manner even of speaking. And so this was already suggested by the 12th century, this commentary by Rabbi Joseph Bekor. He says this: according to this approach, once Jacob spoke with Laban and arranged the marriage, there would be no need for him to speak with Rachel until the wedding. It's interesting, right, from their perspective. And so verse 26 goes on to say, Laban replied, "It is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one." So in other words, perhaps he's saying, back in Canaan, you can observe your brother. Wink, wink, right? Back there you can. But here in our country, we don't give a younger sister before the firstborn sister. So our customs have been followed for hundreds of years. Who do you think I am? I'm a prominent man in this community, right? What would people think if I didn't treat my oldest daughter right by giving her first in marriage? So younger and firstborn, these words from the writer reminds us of the younger Jacob and the firstborn Esau. Laban responds to Jacob's accusation by appeal to local cultural custom. It is not done so in our place. An honorable man would have explained that when Jacob first agreed to work for 7 years, right, he would have told him, he should have told him, hey, it's our custom. You can't have Rachel, right? However, Laban still holds the advantage. Rachel is still his daughter to give, or even now to withhold from Jacob. So Laban is also on his own turf, right? Jacob, having come from afar to find a bride, he's the supplicant. And so why did Laban trick Jacob? That's the question, right? Well, yes, he explained to Jacob the custom, but that's not an explanation, right? He had 7 years to have explained that to him. A proposed answer would be Laban knew that Jacob's parents were well off, and Jacob would be able to provide for the two daughters, right? Maybe that's what Laban was thinking. You know, my sister Rebecca, they got money. Jacob can really take care of my two daughters, especially if they're that time and nobody wants to marry them. And so one of the concerns in that time was finding a good husband who could materially support them. So Laban saw an opportunity to basically downsize, right? And give 4 women away, both daughters and a servant for each. So it's in Laban's favor. Now I'm getting rid of 4 mouths to feed, right? That'll save him some money. So Laban is definitely of the same stock as his sister Rebecca, right? Jacob's mom. You can't trust these 2 siblings if they were sitting on a stack of Bibles. So why didn't Laban inform Jacob about this custom at any time in those 7 years? Well, probably because he was afraid Jacob would have refused to marry Leah. That's the obvious one. Laban may have felt Leah didn't have a good chance as Rachel as finding a husband, as he needed to find Leah a husband, and this was his only opportunity. And so how did Jacob not know about this custom? I mean, Jacob surely would have heard about it around the water cooler or the wells, right, with the other shepherds. The conversation should have come up. They certainly knew how lovesick he was for Rachel, he probably talked nonstop about her, right? So at some point in 7 years, they should have said, hey, buddy, you know, Laban's never going to let you marry Rachel, right? You probably hear something like that around the water cooler. You know, we have a rule around here that the older sister has to marry first. Didn't Laban tell you that? So I got to believe when family friends came over or Jacob was out in the fields working, that Laban's servants and shepherds and friends would have told him about this very important custom. Right? Like, hey, so how does it feel that you're going to marry Leah first rather than Rachel? Or something like that. Right? And if so, Jacob no doubt would have gone straight to Laban to make sure that the deal was still on. Rachel, right? Not Leah. Right? But he doesn't. And it seems no one ever told him. So maybe Laban told everyone to keep it like a hush-hush. Don't let him know. So how could the marriage to Leah be legitimate if it was deceptively done and was essentially breaking the agreement to marry Rachel? So a proposed answer that could factor in God's discipline. As Jacob deceived, so now Jacob has been deceived. It's a whole cultural thing. Here's where it comes. It's that whole eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth culture. That was the rule back then before our lovely Ten Commandments, right? We might say lie for a lie, right? So Jacob was the younger brother who pretended to be his older brother with Isaac. Now Leah, the older sister, is pretending to be the younger sister with Jacob on his wedding night. In a divinely ordered way, we see the older sibling getting payback on the younger sibling, lie for lie, deception for deception. So verse 27 says, finish this daughter's bridal week, then we will give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work. And so the wedding festivities would last for a week, just like in Mexico. So Jacob and Leah consummated their marriage on their first night of the festivities. Laban is asking Jacob to see the week through, to accept Leah as his wife, and to withhold public protest. If Jacob will complete the week with Leah, Laban promises to give Rachel to Jacob's bride in return for 7 years of labor. Now, Laban's language fails to make it clear whether he will allow Jacob to marry Rachel at the beginning or at the end of the second 7-year period of service. Now, we would hope that Jacob clarifies the situation before complying. Maybe he learned his lesson, right? But the narrator doesn't make us privy to that negotiation. He doesn't tell us, right, what takes place. In the future, in the book of Leviticus 18, it will prohibit a man marrying two sisters like this. See? And so, verse 28, and Jacob did so. He finished the week with Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter, Rachel, to be his wife. And so, now Laban says to Jacob, listen, Jacob, I have a deal for you. This will blow you away. I'll give you Rachel as well as Leah. How do you like that, right? I'm a man of my word now. And so I wouldn't think of deceiving you anymore and not keeping my part of the bargain. Now, all you have to do is two simple things. First, spend the first week with Leah, the bridal week. And then, second, agree to serve 7 years. That's all, right? And just show you, just to show goodwill, I won't make you wait 7 more years for Rachel. After all, we agreed that you could have Rachel at the end of 7 years, and you've already served that many. So I'll trust you, Jacob. I'll give you Rachel at the end of this week. Great, right? So even before you serve the extra 7 years for her. So this time, both act honorably, right? Jacob completes the week with Leah, and he gets Rachel finally as his wife. And so 29 says, Laban gave his servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her attendant. So Jacob will have children by 4 women. Cross-cultural, right? Situations. 4 women, Leah, Zilpah, Rachel, and Bilhah. More problems. So, verse 30 says, Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah. And he worked for Laban another 7 years. Okay? So, it's bad enough for Leah, the woman that nobody wants, to be disregarded by her cousin, Jacob, discarded by her father, Laban, and now thirdly, Leah is displaced by her sister, Rachel. Laban gives Rachel to Jacob at the beginning rather than at the end of the second 7-year service. The fact that Jacob loves Rachel more than and Leah will cause Leah a great deal of pain. She will have the compensation of bearing children, while Rachel will remain childless for a very long time. Here's the cultural insight. Culturally, polygamy was a universal practice in the age of the patriarchs. Well, even today, right? The Mormons. And so the stories of Genesis show that in every generation, having multiple wives is an absolute disaster. Socially, culturally, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, and relationally. So the underlining message of Genesis by the writer is not supporting such practices. God shows us the destructiveness of polygamy of that generation and its message even for today. And so Genesis 29 is a micro organism of life's joys and sorrows and deceptions, and there's blessings in there too, right? Historically, it sets the stage for the birth of the 12 tribes of Israel, a foundational element in shaping the nation. Great question. In polygamy, should a man divorce his wives after becoming a Christian? So this one says here, in some cultures around the world, people practice polygamy. When they become Christians, should these men divorce all but one of their wives to adhere to the biblical teachings that marriage is between one man and one woman? Well, this one says, no, they should not. They should stay married, treat their wives well, and do not marry any more women. Furthermore, they would be disqualified from being an elder and pastor due to the following verses. And so, in yesterday's class, in the second class, somebody was talking about this, and they said they were in that situation in Afghanistan where he had many wives, but then he becomes a Christian, and then 2 wives become Christians. And so what happens is, with time, the younger one says, I have to leave the marriage because it is not biblical. So the point here is not to, okay, now you become a Christian, you let go of everything, because maybe God is still working in that person. They're barely new Christians, so to speak, right? This is one of the reasons Rachel takes the idols, right? Because she was from a pagan background. It's probably why God didn't bless her with children to that point, because she was still with the idols. She was still learning about this new God, right? And so that kind of helps us to understand this cultural of polygamy. And so,
would it be possible with, as far as once becoming Christian, as far as divorcing, he still remains married but celibate?
oh, very good. Yeah, that's possible. Yeah,
I'm just
yeah, that's another one. Yeah,
until
I'm pretty sure there's probably 4 or 5 answers for that one. Right? Very good. So Jacob was a confused third generation Semite from Canaan visiting Mesopotamia, a sojourner to the household of his uncle Laban. So Jacob was 3 generations removed from the culture of which his grandparents Abraham and Sarah had. Jacob was a visitor in a culture that he knew nothing about, because the Bible clearly tells us, right? And so, as a third generation immigrant, Jacob was fully integrated into the culture of the people of Canaan. So he knew little of his ancestors' original culture. So visiting Laban and his family was more like visiting a foreign culture that he expected. Was Jacob naively oblivious to their customs because his mind was so set on Rachel? And so we don't know. But what we can deduce from his mistake is that he paid a high price for making an effort, or for not making the effort to investigate the norms of the host culture, right? So even if he knew the norms, Jacob cannot presume that he is exempt just because he's a foreigner, right? Far too many cross-cultural messengers expect this kind of preference, thinking they deserve a pass on some host culture that doesn't favor them. And so they think their status as a foreigner gives them the right to commit cultural mistakes without paying any consequences. And so what does the passage say about God? Well, God works even through the failings of humans to bring about his purposes. What does the passage say about people? Well, people work, should get paid. If they work, they should get paid. People often judge others by their outward appearance. People are willing to work hard for love. People use deceit to get what they want. People sometimes place their traditions above their word. And so the question, this is very important. Who was really God's will? Rachel or Leah? Well, the writer makes it a point throughout the story that Jacob loves Rachel. There's no doubt about it. He's blinded by her beauty and her figure. So the purpose is to remind the reader that there will be contrast in the following verses, 31 through 35, that will provide the answer for God's will. And here it is. So notice the yellow. Now the Lord saw that Leah was unloved. I'm going to skip to 32. Leah conceived and bore a son and named him Reuben, because the Lord has seen my affliction. Right? Surely now my husband will love me. 33. Then she conceived again and bore a son, because the Lord has heard that I am unloved. Right? He has therefore given me this son also, and his name is Simeon. And then 34, she conceived again and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will become attached to me, because I have borne him 3 sons. And his name was Levi. Okay, so very important. Now my husband will love me. I am unloved. Now this time my husband will become attached to me. Very important words that the writer is presenting to us. And so down there at the bottom it says physically intimate with, well provided for, legally attached to, but unloved and unattached. How sad. Leah's first 3 sons bore names that reflected her unhappy, unfulfilled marriage. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, this time I will praise the Lord. So she named him Judah. Then she stopped having children. So here's the clincher. Leah's first 3 sons are all about, I want the love of my husband. Right? So Leah is still not loved by Jacob, even with children. Now, with Leah's 4th son, it is no longer about the husband, for she says, I will praise the Lord. Right? Now, praise in Hebrew is Judah. Right? And so, that's actually the name of Judas in the New Testament. But they don't want to confuse people, so they call him Judas, but his real name is Judah. So why does this matter for God's will? Well, because Jesus obviously will come from one of the 12 tribes of Israel, which is Judah. That was God's will, right? But because Leah was being treated unfavorably by Jacob and Rachel, God showered Leah with children to love, and in turn, her children will love her. So God could have chosen Rachel still, but he didn't. Why? Well, because God is more interested in his purpose than our preferences. Any comments or questions? Yes.
You talk about the cultural difference between Cana and Mesopotamia. How come Rebecca didn't clue Jacob in to what the cultures were?
Very good question. It's a very good question. Well, maybe like in some of these answers here, perhaps they didn't have that chance to speak.
Right.
That could have been one. Probably couldn't be left alone with her, even if they did speak. And if they did speak, somebody probably had to be there, right? Especially in those cultures. Just like where Jesus, he couldn't just be alone with a woman and speak with her. That was not heard of. And so that could be a proposed answer. Any other comments or questions?
I think it's an interesting point that you brought up today that I'd never really thought about, is that we do know the story about Rachel hiding the idol when the search occurs, I mean,
Yes.
coming this week. But she deliberately hid that idol to keep that idol. And that could have very well had a meaning as to why she was not able.
Yes, and they believed in their idol. They believed they had power.
Yeah.
In fact, fertility was one of them.
Yes.
And so there's other proposed answers to that. The other one is that maybe she wanted her Uncle Laban, not to be, an idolater anymore. So she takes the idol. Right? That's another. Who knows? Yes, brother.
Yeah,
Sorry.
The other one observation I was looking at too is, like you said, Judah was the will of God, and when you said Judas, his name is Judah.
Mhm.
Maybe also that's the proper name for him at the time, because that was the will of God to bring Jesus to the situation that he ended up.
Right. Very good.
It's just
Yeah.
an observation.
Very good. Yes, sir.
We are not so far removed from a society where a woman can't be alone with a man who is not her husband. My grandmother tells that when my grandfather was courting her, her older sister had to always be with him, no matter what my
Yes.
grandfather wanted to tell her. And her older sister was deaf in one ear, and she always laughed and said, "Y'all can talk about whatever you want to, I'm deaf in that ear." So,
Yes.
that means two generations.
Cousins
gotta go that
are
far.
still in that, my cousins still live that way.
Yes, brother.
Did at any time you think Rachel realized what she was doing,
How the-
keeping it idle, and then, because not being, able to have children, she realized that this is what I'm doing wrong. I have to search for Jesus.
Yeah. Very good question also. There's like 3 or 4 proposed answers to that question, because the question is, why did she take the idols? And so the first one we said, right, because they believe that they can make her fertile. But other than that, that they have powers to protect the family. That was another custom of it. But yeah, that's a very good question. I would want to say that, I want to say she knew, but maybe she didn't care. She didn't want to give it up. You know, it's like us, you know, we still want to hold on to the old life sometimes, even though we become Christians. Let me end with a quick word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we just want to thank you once again for allowing us this time to be here. Thank you for this story of Jacob and Laban. Thank you for the insights that we learned from it, and help us every day as we carry on. Bless all those classes that are going on right now and everybody that's learning. I wish I could be in one class myself. And we ask, Father, that you take everybody home safely. In Jesus' mighty name, amen.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. You're dismissed. Thank you for coming.